Schuster. I'm the education specialist for the Washington State Noxious Weed Control Board. I'm going to briefly go over basic laws, but more importantly, how to get involved in the listing process, and then give an update on new species that have been listed as of the end of 2023. So, the law has been in place in Washington State since 1975. Although the original one was the first in the nation for noxious weed laws, even before Washington State was a state. There are two main parts of the law. One is the noxious weed list, and the other is the quarantine list, or the prohibited plants list. So the noxious weed list is the one that I help administer with the weed board, whereas the prohibited plants list is administered by the Department of Agriculture and is about plants that can't be sold. So we rely on proposals from the public to list species in Washington State. Proposals are open right now. So January 1st through April 30th is when we take proposals, and they can be changes in listing, delisting, uplisting, and also new species to be added. Just has to be a non-native plant species. So after we get all those proposals, the weed board or the weed committee starts looking at them, and then the weed board reviews the suggestions from the committee, and the final vote happens in November, the day after a public hearing. And then January 1st is when the new weed list takes effect. So if you want to propose a species to be added or changed, all we need is an email or a written letter with as much information as you can give us, but it can be as simple as a common name and why you think it should be listed or changed. So I really encourage everybody to get involved if there's a plant that you want to see on this. All counties then have 90 days from January 1st to update their local weed list. They have to take certain classes of weeds that we designate, and then they can select others, usually just for education purposes for those lower priority species. I'm going to briefly go through what the weed classifications are, just as I don't have a whole lot of time, but Class A weeds are the highest priority species. These are usually pretty rare in Washington, if they exist at all. They're required for eradication. That means all plant parts have to be destroyed or killed. They just can't be on the landscape at all in any kind of way that lets them like live at all. So an example is the orange peel clematis, which I believe only has maybe 1 or 2 infestation sites in Yakima County, and we want to keep it that way. Yakima County is using drones to control these, and hopefully they'll have them eradicated. The next classification down is the Class B weeds. These are usually common in some parts of the state, but rare in another part of the state. An example of this would be Scotch broom, where it is required for control in most of the eastern side of the state, but not required for control in most of the western side of the state. Control is different from eradication. It means that all plant parts that can reproduce have to be destroyed or disposed of. So for Scotch broom, that can mean mowing, since they only reproduce by seed, whereas knotweed can reproduce from any plant part. So that needs to be basically eradicated if you have knotweed that needs to be controlled. So Scotch broom, just as an example, it's not economically feasible to control it in most parts of the western side of the state. And that's why it's still required for control in the eastern side of the state, because they actually have a chance at having it not be on the landscape actively reproducing. Then Class C weeds are kind of the rest of the weed list. They are weeds that are usually pretty common, maybe sometimes easier to control, or of a special interest to certain agricultural industries. Some counties may select them for control, but usually don't have resources and just do education on them. The monitor list is the list of plants that we just want to get more information on. There's no requirement for these. They're not regulatory at all. We just rely on citizen scientists from around the state to report these plants to their sponsor whenever they see them. And then they might be added in the future to the noxious weed list, or they might just have an eye kept on them for a while. We just don't really know how problematic they can be. Then the final list is the quarantine list, also known as the prohibited plants list. This is the one that's administered by the Department of Agriculture. These are plants that are not allowed to be sold in Washington. A lot of the noxious weed list is on it, but not all. A lot of this list is on a noxious weed list, but not all. There's overlap, but it's not completely. It just depends on if the plant can damage our natural ecosystems, or maybe it's not on the noxious weed list because it is a problem in certain industries, like in aquariums, then it might be on the quarantine list, but doesn't have a chance of surviving in Washington's native ecosystems or on our fields. So the weed control responsibility is up to the landowner. If you are renting a property, it's probably in your rental agreement. If you or your or the landowner is required for control, like my old house I used to rent, it was up to us, not to them. Ultimately, the county weed boards are who enforces the weed law, not us at the state. We mostly give assistance and work with legislation, that type of thing. So your county weed board is who you'll go to if you want to report a neighbor and you don't feel comfortable talking to them face to face about a weed they might have on their property. They also, along with your local extension office or local nonprofits, may have assistance to give you like on the ground with herbicide or equipment or volunteer groups or maybe funding agreements to control weeds on your property. It really depends on their resources and their priorities. A lot of county weed boards are very underfunded. These are some resources mostly for weed identification. So us at the state weed board, we have lots of free publications. We're gonna have seed packets again in a few weeks. Also, if you send us a picture and maybe some basic information about a plant that you have, we can attempt to ID it or send it out to experts that might be able to help us better. Your local county weed board, your local conservation district, and your local WSU extension office are also really great for IDing weeds and giving you resources just because they're in your area and they are probably more familiar with exactly what is in your area, whereas us at the state level, we're more generalists, I guess. The Washington Invasive Species Council, as you've probably heard about today or will later, have priority species, not just plants that they work with. And then I really like the Berkerbarium website for plant identification. iNaturalist is good. I haven't used AI plant identification apps very much. I don't like them very much. They're good for identifying flowers and really showy things, common things, but they are not good at things that are more difficult, like grasses, sedges, rushes, leaves that just kind of look generic, that sort of thing. But you're welcome to play around with them, especially to start learning. So now I'm going to go through the 2024 noxious weed list updates. There were 3 listings that were updated made up of a few species. So the first one is Palmer amaranth. This is a really big problem in agriculture, especially on the east side of the state, especially in, I believe, annual crops. So these amaranths can make 500,000 seeds per plant. They're annual, so they do that every year. Each plant will do that once a year and then die. And the seed can remain viable in soil for up to 5 years. They are native to North America, though not this far north in North America, and were moved here probably through seed and soil. So amaranths are kind of hard to identify. These ones are pretty big, so 6 to 8 feet tall when they're full grown, can be even taller. The leaves are one of the best ways to identify them, but still can be tricky. The leaves usually have a very small spine or hair at the very tip, and if you fold the leaf over, the petiole, or that little stem that attaches the leaf to the main stalk, is usually but not always longer than the leaf itself. That is not usually the case with other amaranths. The branches and stems are waxy and smooth, not hairy. And the male plants the flowering spike is really soft and maybe covered in pollen, while the female plants are spiky. Their bracts on those flowering structures are very spiky and spiny. So those are the differences between those. Like I said, they're a big problem in agriculture. And if you are working near agriculture, you want to control these so that you don't cause a problem for nearby agricultural producers. They like sunny fields, they like disturbed sites, they're very drought tolerant. So in 2023, there were 2 sightings in Washington, one near Spokane and one near Tri-Cities. They were both eradicated, but monitoring needs to continue. They were probably brought in separate instances, like the boring beetles in Oregon and California. They really aggressively invade the crop fields and they lead to really massive yield losses. They can be toxic to livestock, and then as an additional hardship to producers who have them in their fields, if these seeds of these plants are found in their stock that they're trying to sell, it won't be allowed to be sold into most states and other countries of the world. So that causes additional hardship. So this is just something we really want to stop from spreading. So right now, we think it's eradicated in Washington state, but it's probably going to keep coming in. They're really hard to control. That's another reason we really want to keep them out. Prevention is the best method. Clean vehicles, equipment, footwear, between sites that you think might have it. Don't plant with questionable seed stocks. If you have a small infestation, you can hand pull. If you have a larger infestation, you can cultivate, especially early in the season before they've started to really grow. Mowing will just make them seed closer to the ground. If you have a large trained crew, prescribed fire is an option, but that's not usually an option for most people. A big problem with these is that they're resistant to many herbicides. So if you have a large infestation and you want to use herbicide, frequently change the method of action on the herbicide you use. And you'll want to do that every year, maybe even multiple times a year. The ones that were found in Washington show signs that they are resistant to glyphosate and probably 2 other herbicides that are commonly used. So they're pretty tough to get rid of once you have them.
And just about 3 minutes.
Okay, so the next plant down is water milfoil and their hybrids. This is an aquatic only plant. Aquatic plants are hard to identify because you can't get in there, but above the water, they have whole leaves, and below the water, they're really frilly. And that is different from our native milfoils, which have the same leaves all the way up. They don't change halfway down. So this is an old map, but milfoils are only known currently in the western side of the state, though any pond or lake or slow-moving bit of water on the eastern side that doesn't get too cold, maybe it's artificially warmed up and doesn't freeze over and freeze entirely, I believe these can grow in. They spread from like boats and stuff moving between water bodies without being cleaned, and they really impact like water recreation as well as impacting native habitats that they're growing in. Controlling these are hard because they're underwater. If you're going to use herbicide, make sure you have all of the right permits and you're using the right herbicides that are labeled for aquatic use. It's probably better to reach out to your county weed board, maybe find a contractor rather than trying to get all of the right certifications and permits yourself, because it can be very difficult and confusing. Hand pulling small infestations and benthic barriers are good on the bottom of the lake. Then the final plants I want to go through are European and American beach grasses, as well as their hybrid. These are pretty much any grass that you see on the outer coast of Washington. On those sand dunes are these grasses. Grasses are hard to identify, but just know that these have pushed out pretty much every native grass that would have lived on the dunes in Western Washington. Just because they're only known in Western Washington doesn't mean there aren't places in Eastern Washington they can't grow. Pretty much any sandy aquatic side area, so like sands on the side of the Columbia River, that sort of thing, they can grow in saltwater and in freshwater. They spread really well, they clone really well, they float on the water and start new infestations. They were planted on purpose along the entire west coast of North America, basically, and have hybridized here in Washington, where the European and American species have overlapped in their plantings. By the way, the American beach grass is native to the East Coast, not to the West Coast. We did decide to list these as C because they are also really important for holding on to sand to protect infrastructure. So like Long Beach probably wouldn't exist if it weren't for beach grasses holding onto the sand and stopping the dunes from taking over. So if you want to control beach grass, you can pull and hand dig small infestations for at least 2 years. There's no biological controls currently being released in the US. Controlled burns work, once again, if you have a large trained crew or maybe a small burner just for your own small property. Herbicide is effective using glyphosate and or imazapyr from September through February. And that is all. Thank you.